Now, the question is, I was already suggesting that there's an issue of outliers. So what do we mean by an outlier? Well, there's something I'm sure you've heard about, the normal distribution or the bell-shaped curve for random variables. The normal distribution is a typical distribution for random variables in nature. And that, there are reasons to think that many random variables follow a distribution like this. The distribution has two parameters, its mean and its standard deviation. So in this case, I have plotted it for two different standard deviations, but both a mean of 0. So this is a theoretical probability distribution for, let's say, a return on a stock. And here the standard deviation is 1 on this pink curve, and it's 3 on the blue curve. Many random variables in nature follow this distribution, but not all of them. And that's important because in finance it tends not to follow this distribution, that we tend to have outliers or fat tails. So this random distribution, the normal distribution, has two tails. This is the right tail, which is high values of the random variable, and here's the left tail, which is low values of the random variable. And the height reflects the probability of getting that value. So if this were the distribution of returns for Apple stock, and let's say standard deviation of 3, of 3%, let's say, then the probability of getting a return of 3% is pretty good. Well, here's 3%. And the probability of getting 3 standard deviations out, that would be 9, you can see is just about negligible. And then I don't even show it anymore. The probability of 4 standard deviations out is essentially 0. That's what the normal distribution says. Now, the normal distribution has been used to describe, for example, human heights or human IQs or SAT scores, or lots of things seem to follow the random normal distribution. And you probably have become intuitive about this. If you see some random variable repeatedly, and it's always been, pretty much always been between, say, -5 and +5, then intuitively you start to think it can't happen that it would be 15, because you're intuitively trained by your life's experiences. But in fact, there are other distributions that are more characteristic of financial returns. So there's another kind of distribution called the Cauchy distribution, and after a famous mathematician. And what I'm showing here is 100 draws from the normal distribution in blue, and 100 draws from the Cauchy distribution in red. Now you see the difference between the Cauchy and the normal. The normal distribution has a kind of look to it. It looks, you see, it's going up and down about the same amount all the time. Well, I'm not saying that exactly right. The probability that it would be 10 times the normal change, the usual change, is negligible. So you never see it deviating from, it has a kind of uniform look to it through time. But with Cauchy, it also looks very much like normal. You can't even tell them apart for long intervals of time. And then bang, there's some big positive value. In other words, the distribution under Cauchy is fat-tailed. So the Cauchy looks like a normal distribution, except instead of just trailing off to 0, the distribution continues out above 0, way out. So you can be deceived by a fat-tailed distribution like the Cauchy into thinking that you're living in a fairly stable world whose risk I understand. But the problem is there are these big events that occur from time to time. The central limit theorem in statistics says that averages of a large number of independent, identically distributed shocks or random variables is approximately normally distributed. But that central limit theorem assumes that the underlying shocks do not have fat tails. So if you're taking the average of stock market returns, which tend to be fat-tailed, then your average is not a good indication of the real average over long intervals of time. Because you might well have gotten a sample where none of the fat-tailed outlier stocks. So my friend Nassim Taleb has written a book called The Black Swan, which got a lot of attention, referring to black swan events. So you've seen a lot of swans in your lifetime, and they've always been white, right? Have you ever seen a black swan? So you might well conclude that black swans do not exist. But in fact, they do exist. There are black swans. And so that's the metaphor he uses for a fat tail. So here is a plot of the normal and the Cauchy distribution. So the Cauchy distribution looks pretty much like the normal. It's a bell-shaped curve. And it trails off, but there's a subtle difference. That there are these rare, but they're not quite as rare as the normal would suggest. So the real world puts fat tails in our lives. So here is a plot of it's a histogram of daily stock price changes since 1928. And what this thing is, on how many days there are since 1928, but it's tens of thousands of days. And so what we're seeing here is that the stock market yielded a return of, this is for the S&P 500, or extended S&P 500, of between, I guess this is between, or of 1%, with some interval around that. It did that on something like 9,500 days. It earned plus 1% on one day. And then on something like 2,500 days, it earned plus 2%. And then on something like 800 days, it earned plus 3%. What's that? Looks like it's about, I don't know, 400 days, it was plus 4%. And then here, I can't even figure that out anymore, something at plus 5%. After that, they look like you can't even see them anymore. So you might conclude by looking at this histogram that stock market returns are always between, say, minus 6% and plus 6%. As a matter of fact, on October 30th, 1929, the stock market went up 12.53% in one day. And on October 19th, 1987, the stock market fell 20.47% in one day. It was quite a shock. By the way, on this day, I was lecturing, giving this class, I was teaching Econ 252. And one of the students was listening to a transistor radio. Do you know what a transistor radio is? It's what they used to have before you had iPhones and things like that. So he raised his hand, I'd never forget this, and he said, "Did you know that the stock market is crashing right while you're giving this lecture?" So I instead of going back to my office, I just thought, what is he saying? I went downtown and I talked to my stockbroker at Merrill Lynch right here in New Haven. I took the elevator up and just walked in on them just to see what was happening. And it was this turmoil, and everyone, I did manage, because I walked in. If you tried to call your broker, you couldn't. He wouldn't answer. There's too many calls. But I walked in, barged in on him, and I said, "What's happening?" And he said, "Don't worry, don't panic." It was this big event, horrible event. But that was the biggest drop, one-day drop ever in the whole history of the U.S. stock market. So I had the good fortune to be warned of it by my student with the transistor radio. The fact that my student, this was before laptops, but he did, we had problems with transistor radios back then. So that's an outlier. So the normal distribution with the same mean and standard deviation as this histogram says that the probability of a drop greater than 20% is equal to 3 times 10 to the minus 71 power. That's awfully close to 0 if you know. I think that the estimated number of atoms in the universe is bigger. That's 10 to the 80th power. But it's getting on like that. So it's essentially 0. But it's wrong because it happened. And I was there. I saw it happen. And I saw the excitement that it generated.